Hello everybody, my name is Christopher Stone and this is my sign name. I work at the University of Wolverhampton and I work teaching deaf studies and interpreting studies. I also undertake research and I've been doing that for some time now. I also work as an interpreter. I'm here as the European representative of WASLI, and of course I'm very disappointed that it was impossible for me to come to Moscow in person. So we thought the best solution was for me to record a video. I'm hoping that although I'm not at Moscow at this time, at some point I will be able to join you. So just to give you an idea, this is my university office. And so this is where I often work, and this is where I'm filming my stuff. So the topic of this talk is to talk about what's happened since 1625. That seems like a strange title, but the reason is that many people think that sign language interpreting is something that's only recently occurred, but we know that it's happened for many, many years. It's useful for us to look back in history and find out what those events were. We know that deaf people have been in the world since time immemorial. And interpreting, of course, has happened where they've been. So I'm going to give you just some examples from the research that's out there on interpreting studies and deaf studies to give an idea about what's happened historically. I'll be covering a number of things, maybe some global incidents. I'm more familiar with things in the UK, of course, and I'll mention some things from America and some things maybe from Russia too. Firstly, it's probably important to say that we know there have been deaf people throughout history and we've had sign language. This is not a new thing. There have been small communities of deaf people that have appeared and disappeared throughout the ages in many geographical locations. And it's absolutely possible that communities came and went without being documented, and so we'll never know about them. Within the UK, and I should say specifically Scotland, there was a princess, Princess Joanna, who was deaf and used sign language publicly. In the 1400s, and let's have a look. Here we see Joanne, Countess of Morton, her resting place. Joanna used sign language and it was used in public, and of course we can understand the reason it's documented is because she's royalty. So as somebody who's well known in history, of course she's somebody who we know about. That doesn't seem to be an example of where we have a community of deaf people using sign language and potentially where more diverse interpreting would happen. She seemed to be a single deaf person, although she used signs. So what about deaf communities? The first community that we can think of is probably in what is now Turkey, but would have been the Ottoman Empire historically. And here's a map of that landmass where the Ottoman Empire was. So it covers modern Turkey and several other countries too as part of that empire. So from the 1500s to the 1700s, for a period of about 200 years, we know that the Sultan tried to find all of the deaf people who were in his empire and brought them together within his court. We know that there were also dwarves as well as deaf mutes, and we have a picture of that with dwarves and mutes and eunuchs. But it seems to be that there was a community of deaf people, and Miles 2000 has found several sources to talk about those communities and about the fact that they scoured the empire to try and bring them all together in one place in modern day Istanbul. So we had a community of deaf people who seemed to work and have a social life together. Some people have also written that they were potentially silent killers, that they may have had a role as assassins as well as entertainers. There's also some evidence to suggest that you weren't allowed to talk in front of the Sultan, and so that's one of the reasons why sign language became quite popular, but also why there was a presence of deaf mutes, as they're known historically. So we have this community of deaf people who use sign language. Deaf children would be taken from their parents and brought into this court. They'd see older deaf people and they'd learn sign language. And so there was intergenerational transmission of sign language. And we also have the record of a Dutch ambassador who was present within the Ottoman court as a representative of the Dutch government of the Netherlands. And he invited the deaf mutes for a banquet and employed the services of a sign translator, and commented on how knowledgeable and varied the topics of conversation were, the Dutch ambassador. But I thought this was an interesting example because it seems to be one of the first historical references we have of a sign language interpreter, but it's also in a situation when rather than deaf people being in a lower status language minority, they're in a high status language minority, and one that has a royal status and that the Sultan respected and used the language. So people were wanting to meet the deaf mutes and engage with them and use interpreters to do so. So that seems to be an interesting situation. And we see this first mention of an interpreter in 1625. So this wasn't something that happened in America. This wasn't something that happened in the UK, but something that happened in the Ottoman Empire. So that's good to know. A second example where we seem to have mention of an interpreter. Well, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that, of course, historically, Britain had an empire, and of course, we're not the only country to have had an empire. And the early colonies of British America occurred when we started to expand into what's now known as the United States. And here's an example of those New England colonies. In one of those areas, known as Weymouth, Massachusetts, there was documented that deaf people were present in the community. One author, Increase Mather, talked about Sarah Pratt, who was a well-respected woman who he wrote about because of her achievements. And here is an example of 3 deaf studies scholars who have also written about the use of sign language in colonial New England. She was born and lost her hearing at the age of 2. When she was young. She married, and her husband, Matthew, seemed to have lost his hearing when he was 12 through illness. And they used sign language to communicate with each other. There is mention of the fact that there were some other deaf people in the vicinity, and we can see that in the historical record here, where they say others in the country who are deaf and dumb. At the time, in the Puritan Church, it was important to go to church and accept Jesus as your Saviour in your life. And you had to bear witness to that. And that's how you became a full member of the church. And people would examine you, the church elders would examine you to see whether you were eligible. And so Sarah was wanting to bear witness and become a full member. And she did this by using sign language. And she had two sisters, younger sisters in her family, who used sign language. It appears to be a language that they used within her family. And her husband obviously used sign language. And so in the examination from the church elders, the two sisters interpreted, and the husband wrote down an account of her testimony, her deaf husband. So we had a deaf man taking a written testimony, and two hearing sisters, two hearing interpreters working as well. So this seems to be an example of a deaf hearing team. We know Sarah was born in 1635, and so this event probably happened when she was around 35 or 40 years of age, so in the 1670s or the 1680s. And of course we had hearing interpreters present, but it's also interesting that we had deaf interpreters present as well. We know that there has been a history of hearing interpreters for many years, but this also appears to be the first mention of a deaf interpreter as well. So it's evident that not only sign language interpreting isn't new, but hearing interpreters aren't new and deaf interpreters aren't new. We know that in 1625 we have that first mention of a sign translator, and then 1680s we have mention of hearing and deaf interpreters working in society. So that's great news. We've been around for a long time. So that's the Ottoman Empire and the British America. This is prior to that area becoming known as the United States. One example of a high status language in the Ottoman court, and then another example of just deaf people going about their everyday life and being able to be educated and being able to engage in things that you might expect them to engage in. At that time, there was no formal schooling for deaf children, and we know that schools have some kind of institutional role in bringing deaf people together, but this is prior to that. Another example where we see in England, in the UK, is within the judicial system. When people commit offences, they're taken to prison and then tried in court, and potentially, if they're found guilty, jailed or let free if they're found not guilty. In the Central Criminal Court in London, which is known as the Old Bailey, we have their records from about the mid-1600s, and I actually looked at their records to try and find examples of deaf people who use sign language. So here are the proceedings that you can find online. We know that the first school in the UK that was established was in 1760. And we're talking about the court records predating that. And I was interested to see whether there were any examples of sign language using deaf people. We know in 1625 we have the example of an interpreter. Well, in 1725 we have an example from the Old Bailey. Some deaf person had broken the law and they were wanting to ask them questions and make sure that they knew the charge against them. And one of the fellows that the person worked with said, oh, well, I mean, I can talk about the work that we do, but I can't necessarily talk about the legal system. The court had asked if there was anybody who could interpret, and they worked as rope makers. And so the person said, well, I can talk about rope making, but I wouldn't be able to interpret in court. And the court accepted this, and the trial carried on, and the verdict was not guilty. So here we have three examples: 1625, high status, and then in the 1680s, in family interpreters. A third example where an interpreter has been requested, but we haven't been successful in securing an interpreter. And then in 1775, a deaf person with a team of people known as Dumb Ojemi. He worked with several other hearing people, and they broke into a house, stole some things, and were caught, and then brought to court. And they brought in somebody to work as an interpreter. It seems that Dumb Ojemi had previously worked as a servant. This is actually the sign in BSL. A servant for this person, a manservant, serving him, being his valet, serving him food or whatever. And his previous master said, yes, I can sign for him to understand. And Damo Jemi was found guilty and imprisoned. And so in court in 1775, we have this example of an interpreter being brought in to use sign language, and they were sworn in by the court, and they said that they were able to undertake that interpretation. And what did the court look like at that time? So here's an example of what the Old Bailey would have looked like. To give you a flavour of the 18th century. We don't know the name of that person who worked as an interpreter, but he was accepted to work as an interpreter. We then know that the first named interpreter who was sworn in as an interpreter, and obviously it's great that it's a woman, her name was Fanny Lazarus, and this is her actually in the court records. Fanny Lazarus was sworn interpreter. And of course it's great that it's a woman. That's an important role model in our profession. In the UK at the moment, about 80% of the people who work as interpreters are women. So I don't know if it's a similar situation in Russia, but for us to have the first named interpreter in the UK as a woman seems particularly poignant. So we can see that interpreters were engaged in court in the 18th century for deaf people who were witnesses as well as people who were indicted. We also have an example of somebody who was deafblind, and they used deafblind fingerspelling. So, although we think that sign language interpreting is new, and maybe even sign language interpreting in the court is new, it's not new. Obviously, historically, these may not have been people who worked professionally as interpreters. Within the courts, we see family members or people who previously worked with people were brought in, people who knew sign language or knew how to communicate with the people in court. Then, as I said, in the UK in 1760, we had our first formal education established. And after that point, we started to see that teachers who worked in the deaf schools, so in the asylums around the 1800s, may have been brought in. And we know that the first school in Russia was established around that time, 1803, and deaf people were brought together, and it may well have been that the teachers did some interpreting for those deaf pupils. It'd be great to know more. I'm hoping there's some research about that in Russia that I can read. We start to see schools bringing deaf people together in communities across the UK, as we do so in Russia as well. We start to see also the empire influence in the UK and also in Russia in terms of spreading sign language, the sign language that are being used. And we know that by the 1928 in the UK and 1930 in Russia, we see the establishment of interpreter training. So we start to see interpreting become a profession. My understanding from chatting to Anna is that this happens within a university or formal education context in Russia. In the UK, it was a slightly different situation. It was related to the Church of England. And in the UK, we often saw that deaf people were supported within a welfare context. So they would go to church, that would be partly where they had some education, they'd work, and then they would also be administered spiritual welfare. So the people who were those clerical workers, the missioners as we call them, would have worked as interpreters as well as administering that clerical welfare. And they were known as dwebs, people who were qualified by the Deaf Welfare Education Board. And we know that in 1928 we had the first list of trained interpreters, although they had a dual role. They had to spend many hours immersed in the deaf community to ensure that they became fluent in sign language. And so missioners were often fluent in sign language. And we know that interpreters nowadays may not mix actually as much as they did in their formal training. But they did wear two hats, as an interpreter and as a welfare worker to support deaf people in a variety of different ways. Interpreters in Russia were trained and then worked in contexts where there are many deaf people. So we can see over the years we've seen many different changes, and we've started to see the institutionalization of interpreter training. But from early on, both the UK and Russia had interpreter training, so we're important in interpreting history. So this is just a potted history of interpreting profession, but I think it's important for us to realise that interpreting isn't new, and we have lots of things that have happened across the world, and America wasn't necessarily the first place. The UK and Russia led the way, I think. This is probably a good time for me to stop, and hopefully you can have some discussions about my presentation. Thank you.